And hopefully you all can see that the session is now being recorded. So welcome again, everyone, to today's Association for Adult Development and Aging webinar, Exploring Chronic Sorrow Among Primary Caregivers, Considerations for Counselors and Counselor Educators with Dr. Tiffany M. Bordonada. As the webinar commences, you may type any questions you have for Dr. Bordonada in the chat box, and they will be answered at the end of today's webinar. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Bordonada. Dr. Bordonada is an assistant professor in the Department of Counseling and Human Services at the University of Scranton and serves as co-director of the Clinical Mental Health Counseling Graduate Program. Her clinical background includes working with adolescent male offenders in a residential setting and adults with disabilities in an outpatient setting. Her research interests include caregiver identity, autism spectrum disorder, chronic sorrow, and grief and loss. As a counselor educator, Dr. Bordonada utilizes narrative supervision with practicum and internship students, and her teaching philosophy follows guidelines according to the constructivist-developmental approach. I am certainly looking forward to learning from Dr. Bordonada today. So with no further ado, Dr. Bordonada, I will turn it over to you, and thank you again so much for being here with us this morning.
Thank you, Janelle. I appreciate that introduction. And thank you to all of you for joining me today. I'm really excited to share with you this topic that I'm so personally passionate about, which is now transferred into my professional work. So I'm going to share with you my PowerPoint slides and just kind of move through those slides. And then I've allowed enough time for us to further discuss and share afterwards if you're interested in offering any comments or questions. So let's get started. So our learning objectives, I'm going to talk with you about just chronic sorrow, helping you to understand the purpose. And then we're going to focus more specifically how chronic sorrow is experienced among primary caregivers. I will share with you some strategies that I found in my research and clinical experience to help you to support caregivers who exhibit chronic sorrow, and then also offer to you another perspective as a result of the impact of COVID-19 and what that has on chronic caregivers as they experience chronic sorrow. And then I'll share with you some of my current clinical experiences and then offer some directions for future research. So an introduction I'd like to begin with is that Simon Olshansky, 1962, first introduced the term chronic sorrow. And this is characterized by the reoccurring waves of grief observed in parents, specifically those who have specifically parents who have children who with mental impairments. And these parents struggled to cope with the loss of a perfect child, in which the pervasive recurrent sadness was viewed as a normal response to disruptions of normalcy. And in full transparency, as I created the slide for you, I thought, wow, this is really going against the grain of, this is way too many terms on a slide, right? But I just found that this particular explanation just really starts to capture just kind of what we're looking at. And then I'll narrow in a little bit more closely as we move through this. And so Olshansky offered 4 basic ideas when working with families who have children with a disability in order to address chronic sorrow. He offers that parents must be given time to accept the diagnosis of the disability. And so that means we need to be patient with them and work with them according to what pace they need in regards to striving for this acceptance. He also suggested that we allow the family to vent their emotions and frustrations and focus on understanding what the diagnosis specifically means for that particular family unit. And then remind families to seek counseling, maintain multiple social networks. And then what can we do to focus on increasing their comfort level with what they're managing? And so focusing on self-efficacy among parents. And then subsequent research has then validated chronic sorrow among parents because it further elaborates on some of these emotions such as anger, frustration, hopelessness. And so this essentially, I discovered this term chronic sorrow through my work when I was completing my dissertation. And I began to acknowledge that there's another term out there that is somewhat related to grief or maybe even related somehow to depression. But then throughout my experiences, I've come to just embrace chronic sorrow as its own. So let's look at this more closely. So here's an overview of the model of chronic sorrow, and there's 6 different components when we're looking at this model. So this is just another alternative view of explaining how people respond in a cyclical manner to both single and ongoing loss situations. And so loss situations, these situations are referred to very significant losses, which is the initial onset of chronic sorrow. And so this significant loss is an experience that is highly individualistic. It may be ongoing with no predictable end. The presence of uncertainty and unpredictability pertaining to a particular chronic illness or a disability can lead to the development of chronic sorrow. Another aspect prior to the onset of chronic sorrow is unresolved disparity resulting from the loss. So disparity occurs once the individual recognizes that their reality differs from their idealized way of being. And this lack of unresolved disparity creates a gap between reality and the ideal, which kind of sets the stage for chronic sorrow symptoms to be experienced kind of in bits and pieces periodically over time. Thus, it's a continual adaptive process. Trigger events are closely related to disparity. Triggers are referred to as the milestones, or defined as those circumstances, situations, and conditions that bring the negative disparity resulting from the loss experience clearly into focus, or that exacerbate the experience of disparity. And these types of events that trigger the ongoing disparity are very subjective. Another component, affected individuals. So chronic sorrow is most often triggered in individuals with chronic or life-threatening conditions when they experience disparity. Therefore, the individual realizes that they are different compared to others, or the norm that our society identifies. And these norms may be developmental, social, or personal. Additionally, anticipated milestones are confronted by disparity, and both individuals with a chronic illness or the family caregivers are likely to experience chronic sorrow as a result of that anticipation. And then as family caregivers provide care for children with disabilities or a loved one with a chronic illness, they become more aware of their normalcy regarding situations as compared to those who are not caregivers. And there's situations and circumstances that precipitate awareness of disparities between themselves and others continues to bring that disparity clearly into focus. And so chronic sorrow is most often triggered as family members recognize their unending responsibilities as a caregiver. And for bereaved individuals, the disparity that triggers chronic sorrow is not the presence of the person with the chronic condition, but instead is the absence of the person who was once central in the life of the bereaved. And so the disparity between the past and present may lead to chronic sorrow as the bereaved individual is confronted with the memories of the past. And so looking more closely at characteristics of chronic sorrow, it's really this perception of sadness or sorrow over time, no predictable end. It's recurrent, it's triggered internally or externally, and it brings to mind a person's losses, disappointments, or fears, and it's progressive and can intensify. Additional characteristics also include recognizing that negative disparity between the past and the present, what my life is experiencing versus what someone else's life, what they may be experiencing. And it's truly focused on this last bullet point, the waxing and waning nature of emotions, often surging during key points. So I try to visualize it with this up and down. It's kind of like this roller coaster feel of one day I'm okay, and then the next I'm just not okay. And so it's this constant waxing and waning nature. And so then for the definition of chronic sorrow, I offer to you today that it's defined as pervasive, periodic, permanent, and potentially progressive in nature, especially for those who anticipate life being disrupted throughout one's lifespan. And so although Simon Olshansky really focused on discovering this term among parents who have a child with a developmental disability, I have since taken that term and wanted to examine that and further explore it among other particular populations, because it seems to me that chronic sorrow is maybe more prevalent in some populations and that we are just still in the midst of, discovering. And so, in thinking about chronic sorrow and grief and depression, oftentimes fellow colleagues will say, they like to challenge me. So, what is this chronic sorrow term? What does this really mean? Isn't it just grief? Isn't it just depression? And, we have some good conversations back and forth, which I appreciate because we can all learn from one another. But what I've found is that traditional grief theorists suggest that resolution is necessary and it's a normal outcome when we react to grief, right? Um, it's more about here's the loss that has happened. What can we do to resolve those feelings so that you can continue in a trajectory of less emotions, a way that you feel better, essentially, about the situation. And as you can see here, due to the cyclical nature of chronic sorrow, it's again that waxing and waning, up and down, but there's also periods of happiness and satisfaction interspersed with episodes of regrief or that anticipation of maybe not achieving a particular milestone based on the loss that you have experienced. So loss for the term of chronic sorrow doesn't necessarily imply death related, right? But it could be the loss of identity, the loss of maybe a particular family unit, or receiving a diagnosis of some kind. And now prior to your life, you're able to compare what it was like before pre-diagnosis and post-diagnosis. And so in thinking about depression, according to the DSM, it's a loss of interest or pleasure, significant weight loss, fatigue, feelings of worthlessness, diminished ability to think, recurrent thoughts of death or suicidal ideations. And although there may be some shared similarities, depression and chronic sorrow really differ in the sense of chronic sorrow is just kind of consistently a part of one's situation, with this whole anticipation of constantly being reminded that my life is not that way. It is this way as a result of the loss. I still have the energy to move forward and day to day to complete my tasks. To whereas depression can be really debilitating and exhausting, and there can be no productivity, no eagerness or satisfaction involved. And so I often like to share this information just to kind of encourage your thinking in terms of how we can begin to differentiate between chronic sorrow, grief, and depression. And so now moving forward with how I have begun to understand chronic sorrow among primary caregivers, I thought I'd share this slide with you today. I just found this online last night at the National Alliance for Caregiving on their website. I know the font may be a little small here, so I thought we could walk through a couple of these pieces. So this is the most recent report that the NAC has produced, and it's Caregiving in the United States from 2020. And they're referring to a caregiver as the number of Americans providing unpaid care, which has increased over the last 5 years. So as you can see here in 2015, 43.5 million versus 2020, 53 million individuals have identified as caregivers. So from 2015 until now, as you can see, the percent has definitely increased. So nearly 1 in 5 are providing unpaid care to an adult with health or functional needs. And then there's some other statistics here to offer to you. 23% of Americans say caregiving has made their health worse. And so because of the increase among caregivers, it's strong reason to believe that as counselors and counselor educators, this is a population that will need ongoing support for a long period of time. And I think that we can continue to support this population, but also know that when we start to acknowledge and recognize chronic sorrow symptoms specifically among this population, we can better begin to meet their needs as caregivers. And so chronic sorrow among caregivers, I'd like to offer to you some research I've done and talk with you a little bit about that and some of my own conclusions based on some interactions with caregivers and clinical and research experiences. And I'll talk a little bit more, but this slide is really to just offer you that this phenomenon is about the living loss. And so when we think about a caregiver, someone who, let's say an adult child, is now having to take care of a parent, their loss of identity is that as a child, I was once, being a child, looking up to the parent, but now as a child taking on the role as a caregiver and caring for my parent, now the roles have reversed, right? And so my identity starts to change. Loss of the family unit can also be experienced, that maybe it's a family unit of 4, you have 2 parents, 2 children, and now it was the parents taking care of children, and now the children are taking care of the parents, right? Another consideration is the loss of the relationship with the care recipient. And this is something that is really coming from a personal place of mine. My father had a stroke, and then my mother became his full-time caregiver for many years until he passed. And she's often shared with me how her relationship changed with her husband as a result of becoming his primary caregiver. She's also acknowledged that she's felt like her relationship with me and my other siblings has also somewhat changed during the time of caregiving. Now that my father has passed, she often relies on some humor, and she says to me, she's like, well, I'm not a caregiver anymore, so I guess I'll go back to parenting you, even though me and my siblings are grown and doing well, but that's just my mother's sense of humor to try to manage, what she's experiencing. And I've talked with her about this term chronic sorrow, because when she was going through her experiences as a caregiver, she often said, I'm not depressed. I still have the energy. I'm not unmotivated because I feel like this is what I have to do. But I'm just not sure what it is, And so in sharing with her this term that I discovered in the literature, she kind of feels like that's a better fit, for her. And, I share all of that with you because, of course, that's just some conversation I've had with my own mom and her experiences as a caregiver. But I published a study in 2016, just understanding the phenomenon of caregiving. And throughout that, I started to talk with them a little bit about chronic sorrow. And it's a true qualitative approach to that study. And many participants could somewhat relate. Nothing was confirmed. I didn't use an instrument at that time to measure it. I've since done that in a different study, but caregivers really just kind of felt like they had a more accurate way of describing their symptoms and what they were experiencing when I offered them this term, chronic sorrow. I think the majority of participants, or just people that I've spoken with who identify as caregivers, can definitely relate to that ongoing cycle that presents itself as a result of chronic sorrow. And so in thinking about chronic sorrow, the caregiver, and COVID-19, I think it's pretty accurate when we say for all of us, whether we're caregivers or not, we have been greatly impacted by the way that we have had to navigate life within the last year. And what we see among caregivers is an increased feeling of loneliness and isolation, thinking that prior to COVID, they had some additional healthcare professional help coming into the home and assisting them in their role so that they could engage in some of their own respite and self-care. And then with turn of events, as a result of COVID, that outside additional help was no longer an option to them. And so spending, let's say, the last year providing ongoing care alone having to make decisions on your own really contributes to significant increases in loneliness and isolation. Even if caregivers have access to their support system by phone or telehealth or Zoom, and just using technology, it's still not the same. You know, there's a different feel when we can share the same space with people physically, right? There's a different presence. There's a different type of energy that's exchanged. And caregivers have really experienced a great difficulty with coordination of care due to COVID, with increased risk of exposure and having to social distance and wear masks. Also, just the lack of structure and routines, that here was a routine that they committed to once they accepted the role of caregiver, and have continued to improve and maintain that routine over time to provide appropriate support to the care recipient. And then because of COVID, that routine or that structure was completely flipped. And so figuring out a new way of structure and routine, and doing that in isolation and loneliness, can really interfere with one's ability to make decisions. It can really impact one's self-esteem or self-confidence that they have in their own abilities to continue to provide care. And then we think about the duration of time that someone is constantly giving of themselves, constantly meeting the needs of someone else as opposed to meeting their own needs. It's important to consider the long-term effects and the long-term impacts that we can start to begin to see among caregivers specifically as a result of COVID. And so some considerations for counselors and counselor educators. This is really a combination of different pieces of information I've gathered over time from research, and also just engaging in conversation with caregivers. But I think we need to start with the literature and what we know currently, and that we know that the term chronic sorrow is there. Unfortunately, there's a gap in the literature right now. Chronic sorrow was first discovered in 1962, really continued some research in the late 90s, lost some traction in early 2000s, and then it wasn't until 2009, 2010, 2015 even, that now we're starting to see there's some traction picking up with this particular term. And I think what I'm discovering is that you offer the term grief, you offer the term depression, and caregivers are just it's not articulate. It's not well articulated for them. It's not accurate. It's not something that they feel so comfortable with. And again, it's just in conversations that I've had. And so I think we need to learn to understand and recognize chronic sorrow, specifically for caregivers, but also among other populations too, who experience some disparity, a loss of identity, a loss of the family unit. It's also important to assess for helplessness, fear, sadness, shock, and disbelief. This is actually pulled from an instrument that I've used to measure chronic sorrow, which I'll share with you on another slide. But the third bullet point, address family understanding, social support, coping behaviors, and competence, really comes from Olshansky's work from the 1960s. And this bullet point also informed my dissertation work that I completed a few years ago. And how I used to measure or address that was understanding, I examined chronic sorrow, specifically among parents who provide care for a child with autism spectrum disorder. And what I did was use structural equation modeling to take these 4 variables from Olshansky: family understanding, social support, coping behaviors, and competence, and measured that among parents, and to determine whether or not there was a significant contribution to chronic sorrow. And as a result of my study, I found that family understanding and competence made some major contributions to parents specifically who provide care for a child with ASD. What I also noticed is that as a result of my dissertation is that the more that a family understood the ASD diagnosis, that contributed to higher levels of chronic sorrow symptoms. And so let's think about that. If I'm a healthcare professional and I'm continuing to educate a family on what it means now that their child has been diagnosed with ASD, and I give them information, it can be so overwhelming for that particular family. And as that feeling of overwhelm starts to increase, the chronic sorrow symptoms start to increase because now fear sets in, shock sets in, the disbelief, that constant reminder, that disparity of what life was prior to the diagnosis into what life is now, all of that can naturally be elevated, right? Competence was determined that the more competent a parent felt, the degree or the symptoms of chronic sorrow decreased. What was so interesting that it wasn't so much consistently though through all of those participants. And so then I looked further into trying to understand that. And parents may say, I feel competent and comfortable with my parenting style. I'm just not so sure how my parenting style needs to shift or adapt now that we've received this diagnosis. So there was somewhat of a disconnect there in their roles as parents. So I encourage counselors and counselor educators to consider these components when we're trying to assess for chronic sorrow in populations. I think we need to focus on encouraging self-compassion among all caregivers, give caregivers that opportunity to engage in some wellness and self-care, encourage caregivers to give themselves that permission to take care of themselves. That in order to provide care successfully to their care recipient, we have to be able to care for ourselves first. We need to assist caregivers with redefining their reality or their new normal, whatever that may look like for them. So in thinking about my own personal experience with my mom and her role as caregiver, she had a very different life pre-stroke with my father's experience. And my mom has often talked about that redefinition that she was striving for and looking for, and she just wanted that so badly overnight that it just doesn't happen that way. We need to be really patient as we prompt caregivers to redefine their reality and to know that their new normal is based on their needs as opposed to what society is encouraging or influencing us to do. And that the new normal can shift and change because you're constantly reminded of that disparity or that gap between what it used to be versus now, and then also comparing yourself to others. And so throughout this process, I think assisting caregivers with creating a coping plan, engaging in them in collaborative decision making, and so in infusing other family members to be a part of that process has been found to be really beneficial. And a major gap in the literature is that we need to consider the cultural background of caregivers. On the National Alliance for Caregiving website, there are some fact sheets that are pretty nicely laid out for you. There are about 2-page fact sheets per each type of culture that they've begun to do some research on, and how particular caregivers from various backgrounds experience the role of caregiving. So it's nicely laid out. I encourage you to refer to that as some way to inform your work with particular caregivers of different cultural backgrounds. And then I'd also like to offer the narrative therapy and strengths-based approach when we are working with caregivers. So, narrative therapy is my theoretical orientation that I align very closely to. And I've discovered that the more space that I can create for a particular caregiver to just share their story and to walk through with me that particular plot and identify the characters and explain to me the thin and rich descriptions of their experiences, I found it to be really powerful and to really understand the phenomenon according to caregivers. And throughout that process, incorporating a strengths-based approach so that I can help to encourage the caregiver to identify their strengths and what they're choosing to do to navigate their reality as a caregiver in ways that they can embrace feeling satisfied in their role as caregiver. Offer them an opportunity to feel happy about the work that they're doing, and to know that when those emotions get really heavy, you were doing okay last week, and this is how you did that. This is the strength that you pulled on from yourself. continue to pull on those strengths. And so oftentimes with using the strengths-based approach, I will prompt the caregiver to create a hope chest. What is it that you're hopeful for? Make a list of things that you are happy about in your life as a caregiver, and to just encourage a great deal of reflection, and to work at the pace that fits their needs so that we can help construct a new normal for them. So in some of my current research and clinical experiences, I have within the last year, it's been a year now. So at the University of Scranton, we have what launched over a year ago is the Autism Collaborative Centers of Excellence. And this is an entity on campus that provides support to community members in 13 different counties in the surrounding area of northeastern Pennsylvania. And we provide support specifically to families who are caring for families and children with autism. And so a service that I provide to this organization is that I lead a caregiver support group on Wednesday nights from 6 to 7. And it's really focused on caregivers, the parents who provide the care to a loved one with autism. And the loved one with autism is of all different ages, not only children or adolescents. But I do that by following an evidence-based curriculum that was developed and is available to anyone from the Rosalind Carter Institute for Caregivers. And this curriculum is Caring for You, Caring for Me. And it's a curriculum that walks through 5 different modules that, based on the research, supports, here are the topics that we need to discuss with caregivers. Examples of those topics would be just simply, what does it mean to be a caregiver? Relationship building, how do we make decisions, advocacy. And as a part of my caregiver support group, a module that I've added is talking with them about this term, chronic sorrow, and to try to help them to share with me their stories to see if there's any alignment with what they're experiencing. And I must say, it's very remarkable with these parents, how amazing they are. It's very incredible to witness their stories and to hear all of the nuances and details and struggles and challenges, but as well as joys and accomplishments that they all experience. And the majority of them will say, you know, it's not grief, it's not depression, it is chronic sorrow. I had a child, I had this vision of what my child would be like, and then I received the diagnosis of ASD, and then my reality is completely changed. And so now I'm spending time trying to redefine that reality. And I'm constantly this waxing and waning, as I mentioned, this up and down flow of these emotions. And I'm reminded that I am still their caregiver. So regardless of what I'm feeling, what I'm experiencing, those emotions are still very present. I still have a commitment to my child to provide care that they need and to advocate and to ensure that we continue to work through a life that is productive, that it's filled with happiness and meaning. And so I find this opportunity to lead this caregiver support group an opportunity to provide conversation, of course, with them, but really just a space to support one another and to know that there is a term, you know, that exists that can more closely align with what you're experiencing. And so I'm very proud to represent the University of Scranton, especially Autism Collaborative Centers of Excellence, and to know that I'm providing this opportunity to community members, especially now more than ever. You know, within the last year, we've seen that people have connected, right, using technology. And I think that's been somewhat of a silver lining for me, because the majority of participants who attend my caregiver support group say to me that if this was not being offered virtually, I don't think I would have the childcare or be able to have access to childcare to have for my child if I wanted to attend this group on campus. Parents have said, I don't have the financial support to just transport myself. You know, I don't have the gas money to get to campus. And so all of them have been tremendously grateful for the opportunity to continue to connect and provide support virtually. And I encourage all of you that if that's an option for you too, that you seek out those opportunities, because it's the technology piece that's keeping us connected. I know that not everyone may not have access to internet and that technology. However, I think as long as we can find a way to support them and to offer resources to meet their needs, to ensure connection, I think that we have an ethical responsibility, to do that. I also think that caregivers, I know I'm a little biased, it's a strong passion of mine, but caregivers in general are it's the population that's often forgotten about. And I take it very seriously that as a professional in the field and as a counselor educator, that if we can reach a particular population, then we need to offer our reach. And I encourage you to do that in your own work, in any population that you find passion in. And so I thought I would just share a little bit about research and clinical experiences currently. This group continues to run. We have 2 rounds of it every semester. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity to know that this is just another avenue to connect to caregivers. And so here's the instrument that I used in my dissertation, the adapted Burke questionnaire. So it's an adaptation of Burke's chronic sorrow questionnaire. And essentially, this is it. This is the instrument. You ask the participant to rate the intensity for each of the following mood states. You add the 8-item scores, and a higher cumulative score indicates increased chronic sorrow symptoms. And so what I've begun to do is to collect some data with participants in my caregiver support groups and ask them just to talk a little bit about some of these emotions. And then now moving forward in the next round that will start next week, it's becoming a little bit more formal, where they will complete this as I'll do a pre-test and a post-test to try to determine whether this group, has been helpful or not, and just understanding how they're experiencing chronic sorrow. And when I share this with participants and just talk about some of these emotions, it seems to be that helplessness and guilt are very common among what my clinical experience is. And then oftentimes the anger of not having access to resources, or the anger of prior to COVID, they had the access and they had the support come into their home. And then now, as a result of COVID, that support no longer exists. And parents will say, I've spent an entire year trying to provide the care that I need to support my child, specifically with ASD. And I found that I'm constantly figuring that out every single day. And I feel like I've missed a year in my child's development. And I feel so guilty about that. I'm angry about that. I am fearful for the future and what will happen. And I ultimately feel helpless. And so oftentimes they're communicating with me, and I haven't even introduced this instrument or talked anything about these emotions. And these emotions are just coming up in conversation. And so it's very meaningful. So I just thought I would share with you that this questionnaire does exist so that we can begin to examine chronic sorrow more formally. There's also another instrument, I believe it's the Kendall instrument for chronic sorrow. It's a longer instrument, longer sentences, takes a little bit more time to complete, but it's very similar to rating, responses in that particular instrument as well. And so I'd like to also offer some directions for future research, and here where I've seen, some gaps in the literature. We also talk about who's the primary caregiver, and the majority of them identify as female. And so what about chronic sorrow among male caregivers? It's a big gap there. It could be a different perspective, a different type of lens. Also chronic sorrow among siblings. I have some parents in the caregiver support group that say, this is so helpful for me because I know how to provide care for my child with ASD. I'm really concerned about my other children in the home and what they might be experiencing, because it's a different type of parenting. It's a different type of relationship. And so what might chronic sorrow among siblings look like? Chronic sorrow among couples. Let's say that they're both trying to provide the care, or something happens to an individual that identifies as part of that couple and the other person takes on the role of caregiver. How does that impact the relationship that the couple once experienced, prior to a change in life, or some type of different change across the lifespan, or a change in a child and how their parenting together has to change? Chronic sorrow among the LGBTQ population, when we think of identity and ways that things are being experienced as a result of this population, chronic sorrow could be present. Individuals with substance abuse, individuals who have acquired a disability. Let's say that I've just been living life and then I have a car accident and now I am paralyzed from the waist down. What does that type of loss do, and how does that impact chronic sorrow? And then also just looking at caregivers from cultural backgrounds, and how do they experience these types of symptoms in regards to chronic sorrow. So here's just some ideas I thought I'd offer for future research and different things that I'm interested in, that I thought would be great to share with you. And then here's some selected references. I have many, many more. I always struggle with how many do I include on one particular slide, but I'm more than willing to share with you my research and other particular references to also assist you in your line of research as well. And so now I guess we can move into questions and comments. So I'll stop sharing.
Awesome. So first of all, thank you, Dr. Bordonada, for that wonderful presentation. I've learned so much already, and I know our attendees are thankful as well for your presentation. So yes, we can move into the Q&A portion of the webinar. So again, if you all have questions or a question for Dr. Bordonada, please feel free to write them in the chat, or if you feel comfortable, you can unmute yourself to engage in conversation with Dr. Bordonada. I had a couple of individuals privately messaged me to ask their question, so I will ask them anonymously.
Sure.
So the first question was, what is your favorite aspect of working with the Caregivers group?
I think my favorite aspect with working with that particular group is that every group session, I truly learned something new. There has never been a session where it's just been kind of repeated information, or even from round to round, same stories, I mean, of course there's similarities, but I truly learned something new. And I'm constantly reminded of the level of persistence, the high level of dedication and commitment that these parents have to their children. And it's really inspiring to know that in someone's life, of how difficult the role of caregiver can be, they still have this ability to find joy and satisfaction. And I would say, I think that's one of my that's one of my favorite pieces. I think the other piece is that a lot of them are pretty humorous about their role as caregiving. And, they often say that sometimes just laughing about what I have to do, is, can be helpful. And so we've built some, great connections. I have some caregivers who have continued over, time with participating in the group. And then I also have some that are, brand new, and it's just, I think it's just also ever changing, and I really appreciate that too. But it also reminds me that this work is just so important, that if any of us can, reach out to the populations that we're most passionate about, to just give them a space to share. I think it's just, I would encourage you to do that. It's so important. And thank you for that question. I appreciate, I appreciate that. I like to share, so.
Very cool. Okay, so another question that someone messaged me. If chronic sorrow can be classified as permanent, How do we offer optimism or hope for primary caregivers to navigate their lives in the midst of their sorrow?
Mhm. So I think because it is permanent, that's a way that we can assist caregivers with understanding maybe here's the trajectory for you that might happen over time. And that trajectory can be a combination of lots of different experiences along the way. And as those experiences occur, we can look for meaning, we can look for happiness, we can look for satisfaction, and we can also acknowledge the challenges along the way. And so I think as counselors or counselor educators, when we let them know up front, here's maybe the trajectory, and here's my role, and here's how I'm going to support you in that, I think people are a little bit more receptive or open, to the support that we're offering.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. Someone also asked, and again, so I'm getting a lot of private messages, but again, everyone, I mean, you can message me privately or you can put it in the larger chat if you have questions for Dr. Bordonada. I have another question that asks, I realize this will be different for each situation, but are there some general things you suggest go into a caregiver's coping plan? You mentioned a coping plan earlier.
Yes, sure. So I think generally three things come to mind. I think we need to create enough space for the caregiver to communicate to us what is it that they need in regards to feeling like they can accomplish or navigate their role as caregiver. And of course, a caregiver story is just so different, right? In lots of different ways, but creating a space where they can begin to feel empowered, that they have the autonomy to say, here's how I'm choosing to navigate my role as caregiver. And then based on that conversation, we can start to identify, okay, maybe you need this additional support, or maybe you need a phone call every day, or you need 10 minutes to take while the care recipient takes a nap. And really kind of, structure that out, lay that out for them, so they can kind of understand that the routine that they are building or creating to provide the support to the care recipient, they need to include themselves in that routine. And so we know at 10 a.m., medication needs to be distributed to the care recipient. Maybe a nurse will come over, maybe not because of COVID. And so I know at that time, my care recipient goes into maybe taking a nap. Maybe I too will also take a nap or take a walk or something, working that out. I think the other piece of the coping plan is that we need to be flexible. We need to communicate that it can change. This is not written in stone, that the way that you provide care this week may not be the same a month from now. That's also something that often comes up in the caregiver support group with those particular parents. Their role as caregiver is constantly changing. And so communicating that to caregivers. So let's make a coping plan for you for this month or for this week, whatever meets the needs of that caregiver. And then the other piece is to be sure to communicate this coping plan with other people in our social support system, or if you can, even with the care recipients, and to try to build some type of communication so that everyone's on the same page. And that when we communicate the coping plan to our social support system, they too can encourage us to follow that plan. I think it also needs to be really intentional. It needs to be on purpose. It needs to be specific. Instead of just saying engage in self-care at 6 o'clock after dinner time. Let's narrow that down. What are you going to do to engage in self-care? Maybe I'll watch 20 minutes of a TV show or something, something very specific that caregivers, it allows them to have something to look forward to, as opposed to when I know at 6 o'clock I have to engage in self-care, but now I just can't decide. So let's get really specific. So at 6 o'clock, if I can, I'm going to take a walk around my neighborhood and then come back. So that way they don't feel like it's stressful to make a decision. So now I have to engage in self-care. What should I do? Or even creating a list and saying, here's the list that you're going to choose from to engage in self-care. And then you'll do that at 6 o'clock is what, kind of what I would offer as part of, coping plan.
That is wonderful. So I had another question. How do we infuse more considerations of chronic sorrow and working with caregivers into counseling curriculum?
Mhm. So last semester, I taught a new elective here at the University of Scranton, grief and loss, and I started to incorporate chronic sorrow as part of our discussions. And and I also shared with them the instrument and just talking about those different emotions and how it was, kind of, it's related to grief and falls under that umbrella. And so well, first off, because we're in the midst of our K-CREP self-study, I want it to be a K-CREP standard. No, okay, I'm really out there, right? Everyone's like, no more standards that we have to address. Okay, I understand, trust me. But I think that we can incorporate just that concept of chronic sorrow all throughout different courses that we already offer. And so pulling from the literature, creating, even if it's just a handout of this term, and just creating some conversation so that we can educate students about this term and how they can begin to make it a part of their conversations when they sit with their future clients, I think can be helpful. I think, again, coming from that narrative approach in my grief and loss course, students had to interview someone who identified as they were experiencing some level of grief. And as part of that interview outline, we had all come up as a group with some interview questions that were kind of geared towards understanding chronic sorrow symptoms. I think chronic sorrow, that concept can really be weaved nicely into family counseling, addictions, crisis, all of the above. No, of course, I'm a big cheerleader for it, but I think it's just about presenting that as a topic and then opening up some space in the classroom to facilitate some conversation. And it's an exchange of just kind of some different perspectives. Again, being so narrative and coming from that constructivist approach, there's not only one way of being or one way of experiencing chronic sorrow. And so being intentional with our time in the classroom, create the space of present the topic of chronic sorrow and let's just have a conversation about it. It's a big, major gap in the literature. And so use that time wisely to educate our students.
So the individual that asked that original question had a follow-up and asking if an individual is no longer a student, what resources, books, et cetera, would you suggest someone recommend to a supervisee?
Great question. Wow, I'm flooded. I have so many titles and all sorts of things that just came to mind. Okay, so there is a book. I'm drawing a blank on the last name. That's bad. The first name is Susan. Janelle, is there a way I could get you the list of all these books I'm thinking
Certainly.
about? And then,
So
okay, I will do that.
what we can do
Yeah,
is when you provide that list, I can email that out to all the attendees today.
perfect.
So that would be
Okay.
helpful.
Yeah, so there are some book titles that come to mind. And I do have, of course, references and literature and things. But if we're talking about how do we incorporate this maybe in work, with supervision and things, I think it's about starting from the place of simply, have you heard of the term chronic sorrow? Do you know what that is? And ensuring that they have a good understanding of that definition and of the model that I presented with you today. And then making sure that supervisees start to incorporate that even in their language, with clients. And there are some great books. They date back to like the early 2000s, but I do have some recommendations. So I can put that all together today, Janelle, and send that to you to send out to the group too by the weekend. And I'm also happy to share my PowerPoint too, as well.
Thank you for that. And I'll make sure that gets to our attendees. So Katie Gaspard, and I hope I'm not butchering your name, Katie, shared, this is more of a thank you than a question, and shared that this is a very insightful presentation, especially in the cases of those that Katie knows are struggling with parenting because they became parents at a young age. Their sense of identity wasn't completely developed before a large part of it came into the role as mother or father. in trying to successfully fulfill that role as a parent and caregiver. She can see that they're also experiencing a disparity between what they perceive as successful parenting and who they want to be outside of the role of parenting. So Katie sends her thanks. Lori
Thank you, Katie.
again. Lori Brutch, and again, I hope I'm not butchering your name, shared, thank you for the excellent presentation. Given the ongoing traumatic events in our country where families lose loved ones suddenly and often violently, is there emerging research regarding how this population may experience chronic sorrow throughout the lifespan?
Is there emerging literature? I think so. I think it's started to emerge. I think so when we acknowledge that chronic sorrow is this up and down kind of experience, and because of that disparity, it brings into so clearly that focus of those chronic sorrow symptoms. If something is very violent or something is very traumatic in nature for the individual, I could imagine that there's that possibility of chronic sorrow symptoms being experienced very heavily due to maybe a flashback of that particular time or that traumatic event. I think when we look at some literature of sudden loss, chronic sorrow symptoms are present. When we look at some literature about even anticipatory grief, that if we are starting to anticipate, the death of a loved one, chronic symptoms are there because people kind of weave in and out of what's real, what's not real. Has it happened yet? When will it happen? That whole anticipatory, nature of it. But I think it is somewhat starting to emerge. However, when you just do a simple search of chronic sorrow, it's really only been measured primarily among caregivers with, different types of caring for people with different types of disabilities and chronic illnesses. And so there's still that major gap in the literature, but I would say that would be an excellent research study moving forward.
Definitely. Thank you for that. And Shelley Herbert asks, could you say a little bit more about what you say to caregivers at the start of group about what you see as their potential trajectory?
Yeah, sure. So I think for me, I'm really just kind of coming from this place of wanting to create some time or space for conversation. And I simply just ask them, have you heard of the term chronic sorrow? And I've asked it just like that in my caregiver support group. And many of them, with being on screen, I see all their facial expressions at once and they're like, what? Because they immediately start to think I'm referring to chronic illness. And I think that's why they have that initial response of, I'm kind of confused. What do you mean? And so then I reiterate, it's the term chronic sorrow. And then I give them a very brief introduction of where this term was first introduced from Olshansky in measuring this term among mothers that cared for a child with a developmental disability. And over time, there's just kind of this up and down, ebb and flow of emotions that are experienced. As they acknowledge maybe those normal, what we consider normal, milestones to be developed for their child are no longer happening at that same pace as someone who does have that normal child. And so talk with me a little bit about what your emotions are and what you are experiencing. And I'm just wondering if chronic sorrow more clearly defines what you're experiencing. And then we just kind of move into the conversation at that point. And I also share with them in full transparency that this is there's a lack of research out there about this particular term. And I've often wondered if maybe this is what you as a caregiver, caring for a child with ASD is actually experiencing. And we just haven't, discovered that until now. And they find that to be very validating. Like, wow, I can really articulate to others what I'm experiencing, because that's it. And you can see them just kind of light up with joy that, oh my gosh, I've just struggled so much with describing or finding a word that accurately describes me as a caregiver. And so for me, I've just found that to be really rewarding and just reassuring that, the term is out there. And of course, we need to do a lot more research, but it is validating to know that I'm communicating with caregivers who are saying, yes, that's what I'm experiencing.
Thank you for that.
You're
Also, I
welcome.
see, hi, Shelley, we can see you now. Thank you for that question. And I hope your question was answered. It was a great answer, Dr. Bordonada.
Thank
I also
you.
received a private message from someone who mentioned, or who shared, thank you so much for this presentation. As a caregiver to my aunt who has dementia and a current school counseling student, this presentation has helped me mesh the two together. So people are
Thank
sending
you.
their praise and thanks as well. So if anyone else has any more questions, feel free again to write them in the chat. And if not, I can start to wrap us up. I'll give a couple of moments for anybody to place anything they'd like in the chat. But also I would like to thank you again, Dr. Bordonada. This has been a
Thank
wonderful
you,
presentation,
Janelle.
and I've learned so much from you. It's been really great. So
Thank you. Thank you,
for,
Janelle. I
again,
appreciate the opportunity. So it means a lot to just to be able to share with all of you. And I welcome all of you to reach out to me if you'd like to further discuss, or I'm really happy to share and my experiences with research and clinical work, and or even just to have a chat about chronic sorrow. So please reach out anytime.
thank you so much again. It's been wonderful. So with that, I guess that will conclude today's webinar. Thank you everyone for being here today. And thank you again, Dr. Bordonada, for
Sure.
this wonderful
Thank you.
presentation. On behalf of the Association for Adult Development and Aging, again, I'd like to thank you all for being here and mention that our next webinar in the professional development series will be Healthy Relationships Inside the Household, Loss and Grief in a Global Pandemic with Doctors Marcella Kepik and Dr. Kim Tisanari on April 9th at 12 p.m. Eastern time. So the registration for that webinar is now open on the AADA Eventbrite, and I just posted that link in the chat as well. So look out for future emails and communication about that, and we hope to see you all there. Within a few days, you will receive an email with an evaluation link that should be completed no later than 2 weeks from today. And then you will receive your CE certificates via email. And with that email, I will be sure to include the resources Dr. Bordonada is providing graciously for us all. So thank you all again for attending, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Goodbye.
Great. Thank you, Janelle. Thank you, everyone.